The trip had been planned for weeks, but as the bus pulled out of the college parking lot, I couldn't shake a growing sense of unease. While the students buzzed with excitement about the countryside retreat, my mind was elsewhere. Memories of a betrayal from a former student, someone I once saw as a son, lingered in the background. Although the wound had healed on the surface, its ache remained hidden but persistent. Among the group, one student stood out. He had sharp features, a quiet demeanor, and an intensity that set him apart. Unlike his peers who eagerly joined every activity, he often sat by the window, lost in thought, as if searching for something only he understood. In class, his behavior had always been respectful, yet observant. It wasn't simple curiosity. It felt like he was studying me, analyzing something I hadn't acknowledged myself. On this trip, that scrutiny became more pronounced. During breaks, he would linger nearby, his gaze seeming to search for answers I wasn't ready to give. At first, I brushed it off, focusing on the purpose of the retreat, a chance to connect with the students outside the usual classroom structure. But his presence unsettled me in ways I couldn't explain. During one group activity, he sat unusually close and asked, "What made you want to be a teacher?" It was a question I'd heard before, and I replied with a rehearsed answer about shaping young minds. But then he asked, "Have you ever changed anyone's life?" The question struck a nerve, pulling me back to old wounds I'd tried to bury. I quickly redirected the conversation, but his response was evasive, almost as if he was holding back something important. As the day went on, his actions grew more deliberate. He volunteered to help with tasks no one else noticed, carrying supplies, organizing activities. While his assistance was appreciated, it felt calculated, as though he was trying to forge a connection. His intelligence and maturity were impressive, yet his behavior left me on edge. Despite my instincts warning me to maintain distance, I couldn't ignore the pull of his presence. Like I felt risky. Now his mouth was impressive and his power was a mix of curiosity and an underlying loneliness made it hard to step away. That evening, as the students settled into their rooms, I stepped outside for a moment alone under the stars. The stillness was interrupted when he approached quietly. "Beautiful night," he said, his voice soft but steady. I nodded, unsure of his intentions. He sat down a respectful distance away, yet close enough that his presence was palpable. "Do you think about what it means to trust someone?" he asked. The question caught me off guard. After a pause, I replied honestly, "Trust is complicated. It takes time to build, but can be broken in an instant." He nodded thoughtfully, his gaze fixed on the sky. There was something disarming about his vulnerability, but also something unsettling. His words seemed to push me toward an unspoken truth, leaving me both intrigued and wary. "Why do you think I find this so wary?" The next day began as usual, but the dynamic between us had shifted. He stayed close during activities, his presence unignorable. At one point, he approached me about the itinerary, but his tone carried an unspoken weight. "Are you enjoying the trip?" he asked, his eyes locking onto mine. The question seemed simple, but his intensity made it feel layered with meaning. I responded with a polite yes, though it felt like a struggle to maintain my composure. He explained to me that part of the trip he had planned was to distract me from what I was doing, so I wouldn't have to remain. Later, during a break, I noticed him watching me from a distance. When our eyes met, he walked over. "You seem different today," he said, his voice free of mockery, just observant. I brushed off his comment, saying I was focused on the group, but he pressed further. "You carry a lot, don't you? It's admirable, but... lonely?" His words hit harder than I expected. How could he see through me so easily, two emotions I hadn't even acknowledged? I tried to dismiss his insight, but his expression told me he wasn't convinced. Throughout the day, his behavior continued to blur boundaries. He stayed close, offering help, asking thoughtful questions, and maintaining a presence that felt intentional yet subtle. During lunch, he sat closer than necessary. When I reached to adjust something on the table, our hands brushed briefly. The moment was fleeting but electric, leaving me flustered. I quickly pulled away, feeling my cheeks warm. He didn't comment, but the faint smile on his lips told me he had noticed. That small gesture unsettled me more than anything else. What was he trying to achieve with these subtle moves? And why was it becoming so hard to maintain the professional distance I valued so deeply? That evening, as the group gathered around the campfire, laughter and stories filled the air. I stood at the edge, letting the students bond without my involvement. But soon, I noticed him again, quietly approaching. He stood close, his presence impossible to ignore. "You don't join in much, do you?" he asked, breaking the silence. "I'm here to supervise, not to be part of the group," I replied, shrugging to sound casual. But my answer didn't seem to satisfy him. "Maybe you should try," he said softly, his gaze fixed on the flickering flames. "Sometimes it's okay to let go, even if just for a moment." His words felt like a gentle challenge, free of judgment but heavy with meaning. Before I could respond, he turned back to the group, leaving me with a swirl of thoughts I couldn't shake. That night, as I lay in bed, his comment echoed in my mind. Was there truth in what he said? Letting go wasn't something I'd allowed myself to consider, not after everything I'd been through. Yet the idea lingered, persistent and uncomfortable. The third day of the trip carried a tension I couldn't define. He stayed close, his actions more deliberate, his presence more charged. The boundaries I'd carefully maintained were starting to blur under the weight of his quiet persistence. During the morning hike, he somehow maneuvered us away from the group, not overtly, but with an ease that felt intentional. "You always seem like you're carrying a weight no one else sees," he said, his voice steady as his eyes searched my face for a reaction. I tried to deflect. "We all have responsibilities. It's just part of life. But not everyone wears them so clearly," he countered. "It's like you've built walls around yourself and forgotten what it feels like to let someone in." His words cut deeper than I wanted to admit. For a moment, I felt exposed, stripped of the layers I had carefully constructed. I wanted to push him away, to reestablish the boundaries that were beginning to crumble. But the truth in his observation held me captive, leaving me uncertain of how to respond. As the day wore on, the tension between us only grew. Every shared glance felt heavier, every interaction fraught with unspoken meaning. At lunch, he sat close, leaning in slightly as we spoke. His words were polite, even innocent, but the way he delivered them carried a quiet intimacy that made my resolve waver. Later that afternoon, we ended up alone by a quiet stream that wound through the retreat grounds. He knelt by the water, skipping stones with casual confidence. "Do you ever think about what you'd do differently if you could go back?" he asked suddenly, catching me off guard. "Everyone has regrets," I replied cautiously. He stood and dusted off his hands, meeting my gaze with unsettling clarity. "Not everyone has the courage to confront them." His tone carried an unspoken challenge that made my chest tighten. I wanted to ask what he meant, but the look in his eyes stopped me. It was as if he already knew the answer. And maybe I did too. That evening, I lingered at the campfire longer than usual. His earlier words nudged me toward the group. When I joined them, he made space beside him without hesitation. The others didn't seem to notice the subtle shift in the air, the way his presence both grounded and unsettled me. When the group eventually dispersed, he stayed behind. "You're different tonight," he said softly. "Maybe I'm just tired," I replied, though I knew that wasn't the truth. "No," he said, his voice steady. "You're letting yourself be seen." His words hit harder than they should have. I wanted to deny it, to remind him of the boundaries we were supposed to keep, but the denial wouldn't come. Instead, I found myself drawn to the quiet strength in his gaze, the way he seemed to see through the walls I'd built. For a moment, we stood in silence, the crackle of the fire filling the space between us. When he spoke again, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Sometimes the things we're most afraid of are the ones that set us free." His words lingered long after he walked away, leaving me alone with emotions I could no longer ignore. The final day of the trip arrived, bringing with it the weight of everything that had been building between us. His behavior had crossed an invisible line, and I couldn't escape the consequences. He was bolder now, his words more pointed, his presence inescapable. As the morning unfolded, I found myself avoiding him, but he was relentless. Everywhere I turned, he was there, waiting, patient, like a predator in a game I hadn't agreed to play. At breakfast, he sat beside me, a faint smile playing at the corners of his lips. "It's strange, isn't it?" he said, his tone light but carrying an edge. "How quickly we can get caught up in something we never expected." I kept my voice steady, though my pulse quickened. "We're here to focus on the trip, not whatever it is you're implying." He didn't flinch at my attempt to brush him off. "I'm not implying anything," he said calmly, his gaze unwavering. "But I think this trip has turned into something more for both of us." His words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. I forced a smile, trying to steer the conversation toward safer ground. But inside, a knot tightened in my stomach, the discomfort undeniable. That afternoon, as the group gathered for the final activity, an unshakable sense of dread followed me. Something was coming to a head. I could feel it. I tried to focus on the task at hand, but my thoughts were clouded with memories of him and the subtle tension that had built between us over the past few days. When the activity ended and the students began to drift away, he followed me. His footsteps were deliberate, the weight of his presence pressing down on me. "We need to talk," he said, his voice low and insistent. I stopped, my heart pounding. "I don't think there's anything left to say." He stepped closer, the air between us charged with unspoken tension. "You don't get to decide that," he said firmly. The words hit harder than I expected, freezing me in place. In that moment, the truth became glaringly clear. This wasn't about protecting myself or keeping boundaries. He had been toying with me, exploiting my vulnerabilities with a blend of charm and manipulation. "Why?" I asked, my voice shaking. "Why did you do this?" For a moment, he hesitated. Something flickered in his eyes. Was it regret? But it vanished just as quickly, replaced by a mask of indifference. "You were an easy target," he finally said, his tone cold. "You've been carrying something for so long." He stopped mid-sentence, as though realizing the weight of his own words. The pain settled deep in my chest, sharp and unrelenting. I had trusted him, even as I told myself I wasn't. I'd let his presence challenge my boundaries, let his words slip through my defenses. And now, here I was, betrayed, left to confront the painful truth of my own brokenness. "I should have known better," I whispered, more to myself than to him. "You did," he replied, his voice cutting. "But sometimes we choose to ignore what we already know." His words were the final blow, breaking through the last remnants of my resolve. Without another word, I turned and walked away, leaving him behind. The weight of the past few days bore down on me, unrelenting, but I refused to look back. I left the retreat early, desperate to distance myself from the hurt, yet even back at the college, I couldn't escape the echoes of his words or the sting of his betrayal. Still, I resolved to move forward. I wouldn't let this define me. The pain and regret would fade in time, as all things do. But the lesson about trust, vulnerability, and the strength to walk away would stay with me. This was the end of something, yes, but it wasn't the end of me. And in that small victory, I found the courage to keep going.